I've got a weird bug on my end then, but as long as it's working. So a little bit of this will overlap with some other stuff that other people have talked about during the Qualia week so far. So I'm happy to speed up and slow down based on how the audience thinks, and I'm very happy for people to ask questions as we go. Otherwise, I'm happy to just give the talk, but I'm just saying that if something doesn't make sense to you as I'm going through, feel free to speak up, and I'm happy to clarify further. Okay, that being said, I'm going to talk about some work that we're doing in the Tsuchiya lab to try and see whether we can get a better sense of qualia structures, how they differ from person to person, and whether we can have a more refined, more fine-grained view of what qualia structures for particular domains might be, how we can try and obtain these qualia structures using distributed online similarity judgment tasks. And I'll talk through what that means. So sort of to set the context for what the rest of this talk will be about, I'm going to frame it through this idea of can qualia structures be different for different people? So what do I mean by that? So we take some observer, some subject with conscious experience. They're looking out on the external world. And we assume that they have some experience that in some way corresponds to that external world, but it doesn't need to. They might be dreaming or hallucinating. It doesn't really matter. And what we are assuming amongst many of us is that the experience that this subject can have is somehow defined by or otherwise determined by the other possible experiences that this subject could be having. So in this example, their color experiences are all defined by the other possible experiences that this person could be having. And that's often what we're talking about when we talk about a qualia structure. Now, it's conceivable, and philosophers definitely conceive of this, whether or not it's possible is a different question, but it's conceivable that you would have a different person who has a different experience and has a different set of similarity relationships between the possible experiences that they could have. So that's an alternate to this first person here on the left. And it's also conceivable that you could have a different person with different experiences, but with the same set of similarity relationships. So in a sense, the same qualia structure, but a different set of experiences. And sort of the point I just want to set the context with is we're interested in trying to detect these guys on the right. So we're looking only for people that might have different qualia structures, because that's what we can actually do with the methods that we have. And these guys with the same qualia structure, but a different experience are not really possible for us to detect. And that's just, there's a lot of dispute as to whether or not it's possible to have different qualia structures, but the same or different experiences. But the point being, what I'm going to be talking about today is we're interested in trying to find people that have different qualia structures potentially, or refining the qualia structures that we do have. So to start us off, the question is, do different people have the same qualia structures? So just very briefly, because we've talked about this before, how do we actually try and characterize or captures people's qualia structures? And we in this lab are doing that with similarity relationships. So we're taking a person, we're showing them stimuli, we're getting those stimuli to elicit some sort of similarity relationship for the person. So we ask the person, how similar are these experiences that you're having that are elicited by these stimuli? And then we do that systematically for a set of stimuli that we hope correspond to a set of experiences. And in doing so, we end up defining any particular experience by its set of similarity relationships. And to just give you an idea again of how this actually works practically, what we'll typically do is we show the participants, let's say for a color experiment, 2 color stimuli very briefly on the screen, and then we just ask for a simple numerical dissimilarity rating from, let's say, 0 to 7 or -4 to 4. So the obvious first question, if we're going to talk about whether different people have the same qualia structures or not, is, are qualia structures actually stable within individual people? So basically, how consistent are the similarity ratings that we get from individuals? And some people naively would believe that subjective experiences aren't very stable, aren't very reliable. These sorts of subjective findings aren't going to be stable in the same way that other psychophysical studies might be, or other like binary categorization or other essentially psychological measures. But it's interesting that the data we've obtained shows that people can actually give these similarity ratings quite reliably. So what I'm showing here is somebody doing a set of color pair judgments, and they're doing 81 trials with one sequence, and then they're doing the same 81 trials again in a second pass sequence. And you can see the first pass is in black and the second pass is in red. And what you can see here is an example of someone who's actually been very consistent in the similarity ratings that they're providing on the first pass and on the second pass. You can also see that people have, for color pairs, this is looking at a group of individuals and how variable their responses are for particular color pairs. They can have actually quite low variance, and they can have very high correlations between the sets of color pair judgments they give across different experiments. So the point of all this is just to say that within subject, people can actually have very high correlations in the judgments they give and quite a high level of consistency. But the question is, when we want to go from looking at whether individual subjects have stable qualia structures to whether the qualia structures are consistent between individuals, things get a bit more complicated. So there's various assumptions that we have to make when we're doing this. The first one is that the same stimulus that we're showing to one participant reliably will induce the same or a very similar experience in another participant. And this is a bit of an issue when we're doing online experiments. Firstly, because the stimuli control is not always reliable. So for example, we're doing all these color similarity experiments online, and different people have different monitors with different screens, with different color property setups. So that can certainly be a questionable assumption. And the second issue is that the relationship between the stimulus we show people and the experience that they have can differ for different people. So for example, people can have glasses or cataracts or color blindness. So there are things that might end up affecting this stimulus to experience relationship. Now, then one of the ways that we would like to try and ultimately get around this is by comparing the structures of similarity that we obtain from participants without actually using stimulus labels. So the idea would be we'd collect a set of similarity relationship judgments from different participants. We would completely ignore what the actual stimuli we showed to participants were, and we'd just see whether the sets of judgments that were provided to participants lined up between different participants. And for those of you who are interested, Masafumi Otsumi gave a recent talk that was related to this, which I'm not sure if he's made public, but it's worth discussing with him and I guess also with us as to the ideas that we could have for doing something like this. But that's not something we have solved as of yet. That's just one issue to keep in mind when I talk through the rest of the data that I'm about to present. So that's essentially, I was showing that for individual subjects, they are reasonably consistent. And I'm going to talk through how consistent judgments are between subjects and whether we can use consistent judgments between subjects to produce finer grained descriptions of qualia structures than the simple ones I've shown so far. So to give a bit of context for this, I'd like to briefly talk about a different set of similarity experiments that was done by people outside of our lab, and indeed people not even interested in doing consciousness research per se. So Hebert et al. In 2020 published an experiment where they showed a large number of people online, so several thousand people online, a sample of several thousand different natural objects. So things like trees or branches or cars or computers, sort of like well-defined objects. And they asked them a similarity task where they just asked people to rate which one of these three objects is the odd one out. And they distributed this across like many, many thousands of online participants. And what they used these judgments to do was to train a model with a certain number of dimensions. So initially almost 50 dimensions, but eventually they reduced it down to, I forget the exact number, but something like 10 or 15 dimensions. They trained this model to provide similarity judgments that were related to what the aggregate predictions of the online population was. But they used a pretty sparse sample of possible judgments, which they actually obtained from participants, to train a model that could produce judgments for any possible pairing of these, or any possible triad of these objects. And you can see that the results they obtained was they ended up being able to categorize any of these particular objects along some of the dimensions which they collected. So you can see, for example, that this bottle ended up being like high in colorfulness and fluid related and shiny or transparent, where this fish ended up being high along the dimensions of like animal related or water related or blue. But what's most interesting is when you look at the complete structure that they obtained after training the model on all of these different objects, looks kind of like this. So it's this very fine-grained, detailed map of like how all of these objects relate to all of the other possible objects. And they're not making any claims about like that this model captures qualia or captures experience. They talk only about like the similarity relationships of object categorization, which could equally relate to some machine learning technique. But it's still interesting to see how they've used these online experiments to produce these really fine-grained, interesting maps of objects. So I guess the question is, can we use an approach that is anyway like this to develop a more fine-grained map of actual like qualia or experiences, something closer to what we're interested in as consciousness researchers. So what we did was an experiment where we expanded from the 9 color pairs that we've shown in previous experiments that I've talked about and that Beth's talked about previously, to using 93 different colors. And we used the same paradigm of showing people pairs of these colors and collecting similarity ratings, except now using a much larger stimulus set. And the first thing to keep in mind with this is when you're using this many stimuli, there's absolutely no way you can show one particular participant all of the stimuli, because comparing all stimuli to all stimuli would take some ungodly amount of time. So instead, what we do is out of the large number of unique comparisons between these pairs, we give only a small fraction to each participant. Then we distribute that across many participants, and we otherwise use the same task structure as before. So before I show you the actual data that we collected, now it's important to keep in mind, like, how do we know that different participants are giving us reliable or consistent data? Because I guess ahead of time, you could think that maybe different participants will have completely different similarity responses to each other. So the first question is, how did Hebert et al. Deal with this problem? And they actually didn't really deal with the problem. So they only ended up excluding participants based on like response side bias. So whether they just like kept responding on the left, indicating that they weren't actually doing the task properly, or whether they had completely unrealistic reaction times. What we did is we used a slightly more expansive set of exclusion criteria for participants. So we used some catch trials to make sure they were paying attention. And then we used the first to second pass correlation to make sure that participants were at least consistent amongst their own judgments, even though that's not a comparison of whether they were consistent between subjects. And we also use these reaction times. But we are considering using more sophisticated methods that would actually work between subjects rather than just within subject. And the sorts of things that I'm interested in looking at is, for example, you can see here the level of variance that participants provide in their judgments reflect the level of variance that participants provide based on how dissimilar they rate different color pairs to be. And you can see that there's a fairly consistent relationship where at either end of the extreme, participants provide very low variance judgments, but in the middle, they provide high variance judgments. And it might be possible to look at participants that don't provide judgments with these sorts of curves and exclude them on that basis. Or another way of visualizing this is just looking at the proportion of variance in individual participants' judgments and look for weird participants that way. But I guess if you have any good ideas for how to potentially exclude weird subjects, I'd be happy to talk to you about that after this talk. Anyway, the point being,
just quick clarification. So variance on both sides, are they variance across subjects or within subjects?
Both in here are across subjects, I believe. I think this is the aggregate of all of the judgments being made by individual participants.
Okay, so then, for example, left side is when you look at a particular pair of color and then look at the variance across the people.
It's all of the color pairs and all of the people. So it's essentially all of the judgments being made.
Yeah, so that one particular dot corresponds to one particular color pair, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
But putting aside the issues of aggregating between different subjects, this is after excluding participants, what the main dissimilarity response is across all of these 93 different colors. And this is impossible to interpret just looking at, so I won't make you do it. But it's just to show you that we've collected this large similarity matrix that we get. And what we can then turn this into, if we apply multidimensional scaling to it, is this sort of three-dimensional or higher dimensional model of color space. And what you can see here on the right is, as far as I'm aware, the only model of color space produced using dissimilarity judgments for a non-trivial number of color pairs. So this model does fit previous models of color space, where you can see that the axes sort of look like they're between red to green and blue to yellow and black to white. And that's sort of what we see in this model here. But those previous models are typically derived not from actual asking people how similar they find colors, but from models of color opponency or other psychophysical tasks. So this is just one example of what we've been able to produce with these between subjects dissimilarity aggregation experiments. The one thing I'd like to finish on is we would like to be able to expand these tasks to go beyond just the color pair judgment stuff that we've done so far and into more interesting or more complicated qualia structures. So for example, one classic issue people talk about in relation to color experience is that you cannot explain what it is to have, let's say, an experience of a shiny object by just looking at the individual color of the individual pixels. So if you look at any of the individual pixels in this picture of gold, you'll see they just look like these various yellows that are on the array above this. But the gold somehow is context dependent. So essentially there's more going on in a little context dependent patch than there is just derivable from the color of any of the individual pixels. And we've been trying to expand our color pair experiment to use color patches that are derived from actual natural textures rather than just completely uniform color pairs. So you can see here one student's data comparing these color texture patterns, and you can see again that you sort of get a dissimilarity matrix that seems similar to the color pair experiments we've already done when we're using these texture pairs with well-defined colors. This is by no means the end of the story as of yet, but it's just to show you that it is possible to do these same experiments with more complicated textures as well, as opposed to the color pairs we've already done. So finally, to talk about the summary and some takeaways, the point of this is it's all relatively preliminary work, but what we've been able to say so far is we get pretty good consistency of intra-individual similarity ratings. So the qualia structures from individual participants are fairly stable. We get a reasonable degree of inter-individual consistency and similarity ratings. So the between subject ratings are fairly stable. It potentially provides a means to produce these finer grained maps of qualia structures, as you saw with that more complicated model of color space. But there is still more work needed to be done to validate these methods. So it would be very interesting to try and distinguish the difference between natural variation in qualia structures within populations as opposed to populations we expect might have different qualia structures. So, for example, normal trichromats as opposed to colorblind individuals. It would also be interesting to assess the validity of the models that we're producing based on populations that the models weren't trained on. So, for example, whether the similarity predictions in these fine-grained models hold up when you look at different cultural groups. And obviously, it's very interesting to look at the concordance between the qualia structures we are producing and earlier ideas of what people think the qualia structure should be based on psychophysical or other neurophysiological models, like comparing the dissimilarity models for color qualia based on the dissimilarity judgments we've been collecting to earlier models of color space that people theorize should exist. So that's all the data I have for now, and I'd just like to thank two students who helped collect this data. So Dominic, who was an honor student last year, and Beth, who's now a PhD student in the lab. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Yeah. So thank you, Ariel, for a very interesting talk. So if anyone has questions or comments, please ask now.
Otherwise, I'm also happy to just talk during gather if people are too shy or want to think about it a bit more before they ask questions.
But let's wait a moment. Yeah, Isaac, please.
Yeah, so I have one question comment going back to your comment about modeling between subject data and maybe coming up with some criteria to eliminate subjects or whatever. Have you considered mixed effects models? Multi-level models?
To do what exactly? So yeah, I mean, we use multi-level models when we're considering the dissimilarity ratings and what can influence them, and whether they're affected by particular properties of the participants. But it's difficult to pick a threshold for like when we should partition participants. So I guess I'm curious as to what would your suggestion be?
I don't have any in mind, but I was just wondering whether you had already gone that route.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I might have done some stuff related to what you're asking about, but I don't think I can succinctly summarize it. So we can probably chat about that together later.
Okay, thanks.
Then Shin, please. Shimojo-san, please.
Yes. Thanks a lot. I was glad to see this because this is probably the first time seeing an argument that you can compare Qualia between individuals. And I tend to agree in overall direction. But if you seriously push this to philosophical criticism, then one might question the following. I would agree that if the similarity structure is different between individuals, then that's probably safe to conclude that their qualia are different. But when the similarity structure is the same, then do you feel safe to conclude that their qualia is the same? Because this is the extreme solipsism argument that, yes, you say, you name this red, and I name this red, and you behave the same way to red traffic signal. I behave the same way to red traffic signal, and in all other aspects, you use this color the same way in behavior. But it's not really guaranteed that it's in your mental theater seeing something unique, and then I see my mental theater something unique, and we both call it red, right? So this, I don't buy this. I don't buy this argument, but that's the extreme criticism. So there may be some asymmetry between the case, the structure are different versus the case structures are the same. And maybe the answer is somewhere sitting in maybe limited set of comparison. Because if you really argue that query are different, then in some other dimension, there might be this similarity, or that's revealing in some other dimension. But anyway, so that's one issue. that came to my mind. What do you think?
Yeah, so I get into this discussion with people, philosophers and other neuroscientists all the time. I agree that, like, obviously if you can show the qualia structures are different between different people, that's a strong argument for them actually having different experiences. But it's true, if you can show consistently that everyone provides the same dissimilarity ratings to putatively the same experiences, it doesn't completely deal with the issue of inversion or other substitution. I guess I'm not a philosopher myself, but I'm increasingly convinced that it's not really possible to settle that question scientifically, and it's more one that has to be settled on, like, inference to the best explanation on a philosophical level, where it seems to me, I'm very compelled by the arguments that experiences really are defined just by their set of similarity relationships. And I'm compelled by circumstantial evidence, for example, that it doesn't seem to be the case that you can lose particular color experiences. They seem to, like, you can lose color overall, but you can't just lose red or green through particular lesions. So I'm inclined towards the view that the experiences are just characterized by their relationships, but it's not provable as far as I'm aware.
Okay, so that's a reasonable answer, but I'm a little bit more aggressive supporter of this kind of approach. And I would argue, okay, so let's say if you tell me your qualia and my qualia are different, right? Then different in what dimension? That's I ask. And adding that dimension, then we'll find gross dissimilarity. And, suddenly, the similarity structures are very different between you and me, right? So this is something you can actually try. I would like to have an experiment comparing color normal and color blind or color anormal, and then on purpose eliminating the critical colors and initially create a similar structure. And then add green and red, for instance, and then all of a sudden, the similar structures turn into dissimilar, right? So this is a case where, there's this deception that the limited set comparison similarity structure says the same qualia, but in some hidden dimension, it's different. And then, it's actually different between color anomaly and color normal in terms of qualia as well. But by adding that critical dimension, in this case, green and red, you can reveal it, and all of a sudden it's very dissimilar structure, right? So I would argue that if there's this qualia difference, then tell me what dimension it's different. And if you cannot describe any dimension, then you're asking for nothing. It's empty argument. So I agree that it's incremental, but adding more and more comparison, adding more and more dimension, we are infinitely getting closer to symmetrical situation where the same similarity structure means same qualia, different structure different. So that's my argument, and this is basically supporting you rather than
I mean, I pretty much agree with you, Shin, but there are certainly philosophers who disagree with us.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm keeping in mind.
I'm sorry, we're getting long, but one more critical question. That's kind of important. So recently, we are doing trademark similarity study with a real patent officer from Japan. He's a bureaucrat. He's the patent evaluator. And we are using real Japanese patent office data. So you understand, a trademark to be approved, it has to be sufficiently dissimilar from any already approved trademark in terms of visual similarity. Okay, so we are doing this, and we encounter a serious problem. The serious problem is that it's unclear whether we're talking about purely visual similarity or including semantics or any associative things. Now, the cases in trademarks are a little bit non-pure because there are lots of characters, company name and, all those designed alphabet and stuff like that. But even without those, there's a shape. There is associative connotation. There are lots of things like a semantics or associative memory or cultural icon, all those things are coming with visual, and it's unclear. Towards the end, it's becoming unclear to us what you mean by purely visual similarity.
Yeah,
so in your analysis, are you trying to control that?
It's difficult to say I am completely controlling it, but I am aware of the problem, and the concerns that I have are often very much around how we actually ask the participants to do the ratings, because there's a lot of experiments that show that if you slightly change the way in which you ask people to provide ratings, like you change the instructions a bit, or you change the background conditions under which you're displaying the stimuli, you end up getting very different responses from the participants. So I guess the most honest answer is I'm aware of the problem, but I haven't done a huge amount to explore the problem as of yet. Because I don't think it's too important to the very basic just color comparisons we're doing so far. But it is, yeah, it's definitely a problem if you do more complicated things.
I think color, samples that you have is relatively safe because you eliminated shape difference and all those things. But still, color, red color has different connotations as opposed to blue. Stuff like that. The temperature is different. Emotional meaning is different. So the texture may have a little bit more problem because with the clear associative memory with reflectance or materials and stuff like that. And I don't have answer. I'm suffering from the same problem. So I just wanted to mention.
Yeah, sorry, my last comment on that is we do have some pilot data from Beth again on looking at associations with colors that are being shown that might be interesting. So maybe speak to her during the break if that interests you. But I don't remember what the results were, so I can't tell you about it now.
Just briefly, do you think all those things stripped out is the Qualia in your view, or all those associative things with personal history and all those cultural icon and all those things are included in Qualia? What is your position?
Very briefly, I'd say the stripped out one, but I'm not. I'd have to go into that in a lot more detail.
If you strip out, then is there anything left?
Yeah, I think there is. But...
Okay, maybe we can talk about it some other time. I don't have any strong position on this. I'm puzzled about it. Thank you.
Thanks for the comments. We should definitely talk about these things, but yeah, maybe.
So now, do you want to say something, or I think that we need to stop here.